Hi, everyone. My name is Arturas Rozanas. I'm a faculty here at NYU's Department of Politics. And today I'm going to be moderating this event. We are very happy to welcome Delgerjargal Uvsh, and we will refer to her as Degi. So Degi has received her PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison last spring. And she's now, as Josh has said, a postdoctoral fellow at the Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. So her work focuses on post-Soviet politics, political economy of natural resource dependence, sources of changes in the political institutions and regimes, and research methods. And the presentation today, I believe, is part of her dissertation project that she's working to turn into books. So I'm sure a lot of comments will be appreciated by the speaker. So Sasha already went through the logistics. So without further ado, I think we should turn to Degi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I also want to thank the Jordan Center for hosting me this year and also giving me this opportunity to share my work with the Jordan Center community today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So today I'm going to talk about my research on how natural resource revenue declines affect economic development, focusing on the case of Russian regions. So the broad research question that I engage with in my research is, what is the effect of natural resources on economic development? Of course, this question has been extensively explored in the resource scarce literature in political science and economics. However, it seems like the main theoretical and empirical focus has been how resource revenue increases in form of windfall revenues affect economic outcomes. And one of the reasons for this tendency in the literature may be that there's a strong assumption that the effects of positive and negative revenue shocks are symmetric. In other words, whatever happens to economic outcomes when windfall revenues come in may be reversed in times of negative revenue shocks. In other words, the money starts to dwindle. I start with the premise that this makes the literature better suited to explain the onset of the resource curse rather than its disappearance. And our understanding of how resource curse can be effectively addressed is pretty limited. However, I argue that there are theoretical and empirical reasons to take negative revenue shocks seriously. Theoretically, from the literature on broader economic shocks, we know that revenue decline can have lasting consequences ranging from regime change to shift in policy orientation and political unrest. It's reasonable to assume that in resource-rich country contexts, declines in natural resource revenue, especially larger declines, could have economic impacts. The resource curse literature itself tells us a great deal about what happens in times of positive revenue shocks. And many of the factors and phenomena that are explained in the resource curse literature, they actually may continue on to the times of negative revenue shocks. So for example, we know that rent-seeking behavior increases when you have a lot of revenues from natural resources. Bureaucratic capacity tends to decline as part of the resource curse. Corruption tends to increase. So these are sticky variables that may simply be reversed when a resource-rich country experiences negative revenue shocks. Empirically, there are also reasons to believe that negative revenue shocks are important. So we know that negative revenue shocks are an integral part of resource dependence, as commodity prices are volatile. And countries may actually not be able to increase their resource production very easily in order to compensate for these negative revenue shocks. Also, when we look at the few countries that are considered to have been successful in diversifying away from natural resources, curiously did so when resource revenues were in decline. So countries like Mexico and Malaysia, the timing of their restructuring efforts have followed decline in natural resource revenues. Even in countries that have not successfully diversified their economies on aggregate level may still experience increased support for businesses and improvement in their business environment. So I observed this in the case of my home country, Mongolia, for example. When Mongolia started to experience decline in their natural resource revenues after 2012, the government intensified its efforts to streamline the state business relations and make administrative burden less of a problem for businesses. And we observed that aggregate measures of the quality of economic institutions in Mongolia, for example, has peaked around 2015, which is a year actually when the government revenue from natural resources were lowest in a decade. So these casual observations suggest that negative revenue shocks can serve as moments of change in certain conditions. So in this context, I ask, what effects do negative revenue shocks have on economic activities? And I argue that the effect of negative shocks on economic development depends on how political elites perceive the shock. So specifically, if a shock is perceived to be permanent, it's more likely to lead to higher economic activities because it gives elites an incentive to search for ways to compensate for lost revenues in the long run, and consequently improve the institutional environment and support for private business activities. In contrast, if elites perceive declines in natural resource revenues to be temporary, then we may expect either no effect or a negative effect from negative revenue shocks. And the reason behind that is elites, in this scenario, elites may attempt to make up for the shock in ways that may worsen the institutional environment and take away from the support for private actors. So I provide support for this argument using two instances of negative revenue shocks in Russia. Russia provides an ideal context to examine my argument empirically because Russia is obviously one of the largest natural resource producers in the world, especially oil and gas are very important for Russia's economy as well as its national budget. And also Russian regions have variation in terms of both production of oil and gas, as well as economic development and the level of business activities. So this variation allows me to try to identify the causal relationship between negative revenue shocks and indicators of economic development. So here I have two maps that roughly lays out the geographic distribution of oil and gas production in Russia. So we see that there's considerable variation across regions. And also notable fact is that there's a high level of correlation between oil extraction in Russia and gas extraction in Russia. In other words, many of the same regions that produce oil also produce gas, and that becomes a useful fact for my research design. So what happened in Russia in 2002 and 2014? So in 2002, as part of Russia's tax reform, Russia's oil and gas producing regions experienced considerable decline in their natural resource revenues, and as a result, their overall regional budget. This reform required centralization of the collection and allocation of oil and gas revenues. And this example is used in my research as an example of a permanent shock, a shock that was perceived by the regional elites as permanent in this case. And the second shock I look at is oil and gas price induced shock in 2014. So this is an example of a more temporary shock that's related to the global commodity markets. So in 2002, what happened? So the part of the tax reform code in Russia required centralization of natural resource revenues from the regions to the federal government. Before the reform, about 60% of taxes on mining operations accrued to the regional government budgets. However, after 2002, almost all of the oil and gas revenues were directed towards Moscow, specifically 100% of mineral extraction tax on gas, 90% of the same tax on oil, and all of the export tax revenues on oil and gas and hydrocarbon extraction tax were all shifted to the federal government. So I consider it to be a particularly useful case of a negative revenue shock for several reasons. So first, oil and gas regions experienced considerable loss in their regional budgets as a result of this shock. For example, Tyumen, which is the largest producer of oil and gas in Russia, it had about 50% of its regional budget came from oil and gas in 2002. This figure dropped to about 20% by 2005. And when we look at the data from other regions, we notice similar declines in regional budgets of oil and gas rich regions. And the second,
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
So all this revenue is taken away that had been going. Was there some form of compensation going back? Was this just described to the regions as you will just have less revenue, or was it as part of some sort of budget rationalization process whereby the central government is going to collect all this revenue, but revenue is going to come back to the regions in this form? Can you just give a little more context on that?
Mm-hmm. So the federal government did provide some compensation through federal transfers to some of the regions, like Tatarstan, for example. It has received a considerable amount of federal transfer supposedly to compensate for this shock. However, as the data shows, and also according to the regional government officials, it was not nearly enough to actually offset the effect of this negative shock. And Tatarstan was in a unique position because it had more leverage in dealing with Moscow, but many of the other regions, even though they specifically asked for federal compensation, they did not receive sufficient funds to compensate for this. And the kind of rationalization behind this centralization process was to equalize the regions. So the idea was to actually take the oil and gas revenues away from the relatively developed oil and gas rich regions and distribute it to the resource poor, less developed regions. So even though there are some evidence of transfers in the other direction, I don't consider to be large enough to offset the overall impact of the shock.
And just one more clarification. So was this compensation that went back to the regions, was that done through some sort of specific formula? Or was that more sort of Yeltsin era-esque individual negotiations with regions one-on-one?
So it was mostly done on ad hoc basis, my understanding. So regions initially tried to make the federal government to pull the reform back in like Federation Council and other institutions collectively. But at that time, Federation Council as an institution was becoming weaker. Also, there were disagreements among the oil and gas regions about how they would approach and specify the right percentage of regional and federal share. So eventually, it's just basically regions trying to negotiate with Moscow. The second reason I believe that it is a suitable shock to examine is that it was exogenous to the incentives of regional elites. So as I was just answering the clarification question now, the regional elites obviously did not want to give away their share of natural resource revenue. So they attempted to reverse this policy in the Federation Council collectively. And there are examples of regional governments individually trying to exert pressure on Moscow. And over time, it has become clear that it's actually not going to succeed. And we should remember it's happening in context of rapidly increasing political centralization in Moscow. It was after the Chechen War. So regional governments quickly understood that it would have to be either Moscow's way or the highway. I think that's the expression. So that's why it was an exogenous shock, and regional elites were kind of put in a position where they had to figure out how to increase their revenues themselves. And it was also a policy shift that's likely to alter the time horizons of regional actors. So I expect the shock to have significant impact on the incentive structures of regional governments. Lastly, it's a very important point. The reform had left important tax instruments for the regions. So a significant portion of corporate and income tax revenues accrued to the regional budget, but regional governments could not increase their regional revenues just by increasing the percentage of tax imposed on businesses arbitrarily. So there was a federal guideline that kind of capped the region's ability to increase tax rate. So I see it as leaving the regional governments with the only choice of expanding their tax base in order to increase their revenue. So it would be an ideal case to see if these types of long-term negative shocks have effect on economic outcomes. In contrast to that, in 2014, the 2014 shock was seen as a temporary shock. One of the reasons for this is the nature of the shock, because the shock was not a policy-based shock like the 2002 shock, but it was a market-induced shock. In mid-2014, the prices of oil and gas dropped considerably. Between 2013 and 2015, a barrel of oil lost approximately half of its value, while the loss for a million BTU of gas was around 30%. Both these prices bounced back around 2016, but the gain has not been sufficient enough to offset the plunge of 2014. This figure visually shows that in 2014, the price drops were rather significant. So this shock was widely viewed as a temporary shock because regional elites often refer to it as a part of global boom, commodity market boom and bust. They also encouraged citizens to hang on as the market would turn the corner soon. What you may wonder, if oil and gas revenues have been centralized since 2002, how this shock may further lead to a decline in resource-rich regions' budgets. And the reason is, as I mentioned before, corporate and individual income taxes were still mostly accruing to the regional budgets. So when the 2014 shock hit, resource-rich regions also experienced decline in the regional budgets. So the core quantitative exercise I do in this research is estimating a difference in differences model on a panel data of Russia for each of the two shocks. In other words, I compare the differences between resource-rich and resource-poor regions in the levels of business activities before and after of each shocks. So the main dependent variable is two measures of business activities in a given region. The main independent variable is a measure of negative revenue shock. And the idea there is to capture the vulnerability of these regions to these negative shocks. And this measure of oil and gas production is interacted with an indicator variable that equals to 1 if the observation is in the post-treatment period and 0 otherwise. I control for a number of region level variables that may have effect on business activities in a region, such as income per capita, region tax capacity index, population, and so on. And I also include year fixed effects and region fixed effects. Just a few words on the dependent and independent variables. So I try to focus on private economic activities that are sensitive to short-term policy changes and that also have potential to contribute to sustainable growth. So for the 2002 regressions, for the permanent shock, the dependent variables are private investment in fixed capital per capita and small business entry per 10,000 enterprises. And these indicators of business activities work pretty well for another reason, I think, which is that these are costly signals from private business actors that would signal actual confidence in the business environment and the overall economic climate of the region. For 2014 regressions, for the temporary shock, the dependent variables change a little. I use, instead of levels of investment and small business entry, I use their annual growth. And the main reason is that in a difference in differences model, the main assumption is that there's a parallel trend before the shock between the two groups of control and treatment groups. And my results that I will discuss shortly from the permanent shock in 2002 kind of negate this parallel trends assumption. So instead of relying on measurements of levels, I decided to use annual growth in fixed capital per capita and annual growth in small business entry per 10,000 firms. I additionally included two more measures of the dependent variable, employment in manufacturing and loans to individual entrepreneurs, just to see if there has been kind of sectoral shift from the resource sector to to sectors that are more oriented towards sustainable economic growth.
So Degi, can I ask a question about this? So
Sure.
To what degree can we be certain that these outcomes that you are measuring are results of the policies of the local governments, as opposed to them being directly affected by changing oil prices? So let's say 2014 shock. So 2014 shock did lead, as far as I remember that period to contraction in consumption just across the board in Russia, right? Contraction of incomes. And so your focus here sort of that the government did something to encourage or discourage business to increase tax rates or decrease tax rates. So why are you looking, why wouldn't be more sort of faithful to the idea of the paper to look directly into tax rates that businesses are charged as opposed to sort of the growth of the businesses that are, you know, results of multiple things that are happening in addition, or in spite of what the local governments are doing?
So part of the reason I'm using this as the dependent variable is practical in that because my the time period I'm focusing on is rather large. There's scarce data on like government policies across this long span of time. And secondly, I do consider economic channels that may actually be driving these measures of the dependent variable, and they actually suggest that they may not be the case. So I have a section later on alternative explanations where I can maybe talk about it a little bit more.
All right, and so one more question, if I may. Could you just tell us a bit, so how do you calculate the revenue lost? So is this from governmental data? So is it that each local government registers how much revenue they receive from natural resources and you use that as a baseline? So the previous year is a baseline, and then how do you calculate, just basically how do you calculate SI in your previous equation?
So that's actually on the next slide here. So I actually use production of oil and gas to proxy for the degree of government revenue loss. The idea there being that regions that produce more oil and gas are more likely to be vulnerable to these shocks, assuming that the revenue increases and decreases would be proportional to the amount of oil and gas extracted in the regions. So I use both binary and continuous measures of the independent variable. And this figure shows the distribution of the oil and gas extraction in the regions. And the red line shows the cutoff point that I use to determine the binary measures of the independent variable.
And this is this prorated by the population in the region?
It's not.
I see. So just sort of total number of extracted, of oil extracted, I see. Okay.
Yeah, oil and gas combined, yeah. Okay. So moving on to the main results, what I find here is that in regions that produced oil and gas and that were affected by the negative shock in 2002, we see that they experienced higher level of investment in fixed capital by private owners compared to the regions that were resource poor, as signified by the positive and statistically significant coefficients of the first line variables there. When we look at the small business entry, then we also see that resource-rich regions after 2010 experienced higher rate of small business entry to market, and this coefficient is statistically significant in the case of continuous measure of the independent variable. When we look at the temporary shock, the 2014 shock, we see that this shock did not have a similar positive effect on private investment. which are the first two columns in this table, and small business entry, which are the second two columns in the table. So here, in regards with the effects of the 2014 shock, the coefficients on the interaction of the shock variable and the post-2014 indicator variables are not statistically significant. However, I find it interesting that on small business entry, for example, the coefficients are negative. When we consider the other additional dependent variables that I mentioned before, employment in manufacturing, which are the dependent variables in the first two columns, and entrepreneurial loans given by regions, which are in the third and fourth columns of this table. So they are consistently negative, even though they're not significant at conventional level of statistical significance. So I interpret these results as the permanent shock having a notable effect on private investment and small business entry levels in oil and gas regions in Russia after 2002 compared to others. Even though the coefficients are not sizable, they translate into a notable divergence in private investment and small business entry in resource-rich versus resource-poor regions, moving from the 25th percentile of resource dependence to the 85th percentile is associated with about 14% to 17% higher level of private investment in fixed capital. And this number is even larger for small business entry as 70 to 80%. However, we do not observe this continuation of this positive effect of negative shocks after the temporary shock, as growth levels in private investment and small business entry did not improve in resource-rich regions after 2014. So I want to talk about my qualitative work here a little bit. So I get these results from the quantitative analysis, and I wondered what may be the reasons behind it. So I conducted research in Moscow and two resource-rich regions of Russia, Tyumen and Tatarstan. Moscow was an obvious case to speak with scholars and people who are working in the federal government. I chose Tyumen and Tatarstan relying on the logic of most different cases. So the idea here is to choose cases that are similar in their independent and dependent variables, but that differ significantly in the potentially confounding variables. So if the cases are chosen well, this approach may be helpful in ruling out alternative explanations. So both these regions were vulnerable to the negative resource revenue shocks, as Tyumen is the largest oil and gas producer in Russia, and Tatarstan stands in the third place. However, they differ in many important aspects. For example, in their relationship with the federal government, Tatarstan has more autonomy and history of bilateral relations with Moscow, whereas Tyumen does not have that type of autonomous advantage. The business community in the regions also broadly differ. In Tatarstan, the state holds shares in many of its large businesses, like Kamaz factory, whereas in Tyumen, the business community is often characterized as pluralist. So there's more diversity and participation from the private business community in economic activities. Political stability is also very different in Tatarstan and Tyumen. Tatarstan had only one turnover of governor in the years that I'm studying, whereas Tyumen had 4 different governors in this period, and the implication of that would be the business community may, if political stability played a role for the level of investment and small business entry, then Tyumen and Tatarstan would pursue different paths given their differences in political stability. The investment climate is also different. The societal composition is also different, as Tatarstan has majority Tatar population, whereas Tyumen is majority Russian, and there's a large body of literature that suggests that this societal and ethnic composition can affect the business environment and cooperation between the state and the business community. So I conducted interviews with politicians, business people, and scholars in these regions in 2015 to 16 and 2018. I also examined other local documents and news sites to get an idea of how these two shocks were perceived by local politicians and how it may have incentivized them to change their policies towards businesses and the business environment. And I found that the perception of the duration of the two shocks differed considerably. So as mentioned earlier, in the case of the permanent shock, the regional governments attempted to reverse the permanent shock by in several avenues. They tried to submit proposals to the Federation Council. They threatened to boycott the parliamentary election in 2003. Some pled with the federal government to receive funds large enough to compensate for the lost revenues. However, following the few years after 2002, it became mostly clear that regional governments in oil and gas-rich regions are not going to get back their money from oil and gas. So this quote from a local scholar in Tyumen kind of explains the situation that the regional government was put into. So it reads, in view of the fact that all of the revenues from the mineral extraction taxes ceased to the federal budget, only the profit tax was left for the oil regions. However, rational entities moved their profits to either offshore or to where their headquarters are located, leaving the region little of value. In the end, it turned out that income tax from those working in the manufacturing industry became a basic part of revenue of the region. In contrast to this 2002 shock, the price shock of 2014 was viewed widely as a temporary shock that the regions could deal with. Regional governments framed the shock as part of the commodity boom and bust cycle in official reports and news. They also observed that the federal government provided relief to some regions, not necessarily oil and gas regions, but to poorer regions during the 2009 to 2010 economic downturn. So they may have had reason to believe that the federal government actually may come to rescue them in the case of the 2014 shock. So after each of the two shocks, we can observe notable changes in the government policies regarding private businesses and investment, as well as the business environment. So regional governments of Tatarstan and Tyumen both increased fiscal support for private businesses after 2002. So they reduced their corporate tax rate for more businesses and in more sectors compared to the case was before 2002. However, after 2014, both regions started to reduce their tax benefits given to businesses and the fiscal support provided to various businesses, even though discursively we can observe that they continue to be committed to supporting these businesses. So just one figure that could be telling is in 2014, tax benefit per registered business in Tatarstan went down by almost 25%, in Tyumen by almost 90%. And the declining trend continued until 2017. So the regional governments of both of these regions, they also seem to have invested in institutions that encourage state-business interactions after the permanent shock of 2002. So both regions established various state agencies to support investment and entrepreneurship. Most notably in Tatarstan in 2002, in Tyumen in 2006. Between this time period, various state agencies that provide guarantee to small businesses, that provide support for starting new businesses emerged, and notably sponsored by the regional governments. Another thing I noticed is that small business associations and communities started to emerge in both of the regions. And also that the governments started to convene official meetings with regional enterprises and entrepreneurs. One example that's often referred to as success is Tatarstan's Congress of Entrepreneurs. So until the 2014 shock, they have been meeting quite regularly, and just looking at the meeting records and minutes suggests that it wasn't mere theater of state business interactions, but as a result of these meetings, specific policy changes have occurred. When we look at the aftermath of the 2014 shock, we see that many of these institutions have declined. So some of the funds started to suffer loss in financial support from the state. Numerous of these organizations suffered from leadership crisis after 2014, when in Tyumen, for example, the deputy head of the Guarantee Fund of Support for Small and Medium Entrepreneurs were accused of fraud, and he had to go on trial. That basically undermined the legitimacy of this organization. Also, business association leaders that I have spoken with reported that they are increasingly harassed and repressed by government. So one example of that was the Small and Medium Business Association in Tatarstan. It was one of the first organizations to represent small and medium business association, small and medium businesses in the region. It was established in 2002. Many looked up to this organization and its leader as a de facto representation of the private sector in Tatarstan. Unfortunately, in 2014, the person who established this organization and have represented this organization since 2002, he was arrested for embezzling government funds because he was sitting on some committee to give grants to small businesses. And looking at the court documentations, and also many of the people who work with the small and medium businesses in the region suggest that it was a political persecution, and it kind of is symptomatic of the regional government's attitude towards the small and medium business community. And also the official meetings between the regional government and businesses became quite irregular. Some of them have even ceased to exist after 2014. Also, Tatarstan and Tyumen seem to have taken initiative to reduce administrative burden on businesses after the permanent shock. So Tatarstan streamlined business registration and taxation procedures in late 2002, even before the federal government initiated made initiations in this direction. Tyumen also established its first unified center in 2007. Also, the regional governments adopted a number of directives to control the inspections made by state officials with varying levels of success. After a temporary shock of 2014, however, administrative burden on businesses may have increased. Many businesses I talked to suggested that as the economic conditions worsened after 2014, more bureaucrats relied on extracting resources from businesses. When we look at the data on economic crimes, for example, which can signify the state's intervention in businesses, there's also considerable change after 2014 shock. So this indicator of a number of economic crimes brought on by the state had been decreasing prior to 2014 for several years. After 2014, the number of individuals accused of economic crimes increased by 13% in Tatarstan and more than 50% in Tyumen. And this trend had continued until 2014, and it could be one indicator of the environment that the entrepreneurs and business entities are operating since 2004. And very quickly, this qualitative assessment is consistent with a more systematic view of institutions and the investment climate in resource-dependent and non-dependent regions. So here I ran the baseline regressions, but instead of using indicators of business activities, I used data on governance scores that measure regime openness and investment climate from RA expert in Russia. And we see that after 2002, which that first two columns of this table show, oil resource producing regions actually experienced positive and statistically significant increase in the regime openness as well as the investment climate. When we look at the effects of the temporary shock of 2014, which the columns 3 and 4 of this table show, we see that regime openness has worsened in oil and gas regions after the 2014 shock, and investment climate had not changed in a statistically significant manner after the 2014 shock. So I want to quickly address a couple of plausible alternative explanations for improvements in private investment in fixed capital and small business entry. So one of the most plausible alternative explanation is that it's not necessarily the government policies and improvements in institutions that led to higher levels of investment in small business entry, but rather it's the economic conditions in producer regions due to higher level of hydrocarbon prices in the 2000s. So it's entirely possible. In general, the fast economic growth of Russia overall in the 2000s is attributed to rising oil and gas prices in the 2000s. So I deal with this possible alternative explanation in two ways. First, I included the value of resource production in the baseline regressions, and it doesn't, including this control, does not change the sign as well as the statistical significance of the independent variable of interest. And I also look at economic outcomes that may have happened as a result of high oil and gas prices in 2002. So what I see here is actually surprisingly after 2002, as the first column shows here, unemployment was higher in oil and gas producing regions, and GRP growth was actually lower in these regions. And I take it as suggestive evidence that economic mechanisms were not behind the increase in private investment and small business entry after the permanent shock. Second, it may be a story of equalization. As I mentioned earlier, one of the rationale for the centralization of the 2002 shock, centralization of resource revenues in 2002 was that it was going to be used to save money for a rainy day, to create a fund, and secondly, to equalize the regions. So in order to see whether equalization accounts for the results that I find, I ran the baseline regressions with federal transfers as the determinants of differential levels of economic activities after 2002. And the results showed that as for private investment, regions that received higher level of federal transfers actually experienced higher level of private investment, not lower. And small business growth in recipient regions, in other words, resource poor regions, was not significantly different from donor regions, most of whom are oil and gas regions. Lastly, it may be the case that autonomous regions, which constitute a considerable part of Russia's oil and gas-rich regions, they may be driving the results. So it's well documented, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, that autonomous regions have political and economic dynamics that are different from other regions. So what I find in the quantity part especially may not be the result of actual government policy change, but rather the peculiarity of autonomous regions. I included a control for an interaction between autonomous regions and post-shock indicator variable, and the main results do not change. So very quickly, to conclude, the levels of private investment in fixed capital and small business entry increased in Russia's oil and gas producing regions after Moscow centralized resource revenues in 2002. However, there's suggestive evidence that they decelerated following 2014 when oil and gas price decline further reduced producer regions' revenues. And this shock was widely seen as temporary. And I argue that the main reason behind the effects of the two types of shocks appears to be the differences in the government's perception of the shocks and the consequent policy changes they adopted to respond to the two types of shocks. More broadly, I argue that negative revenue shocks in resource-rich states can serve as moments of change if the appropriate authorities have the incentive. And the implication of this argument is that international interventions to mitigate the resource curse may benefit from timing it closely to negative revenue shocks. And lastly, I found the findings of my research to be hopeful in some regard, because when the incentives are right, even regional governments in Russia with restricted amount of policy autonomy and capacity can make decisions that promote sustainable growth. So if regional governments in Russia can do it, national governments would be in a position to do a better job in promoting sustainable growth in their countries. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Degi. Great work. I've seen this project in development at various stages. It's very nice to see how it's all sort of coming about. I think that the idea of looking into negative revenue shocks as sort of mirror image of the literature that is mostly focusing on the positive shocks is a very good one. I haven't seen it done before, so I think it's super interesting. So I wanted to open the floor for people to ask questions.
Yes, thanks for a wonderful presentation, Degi. I'm going to have to leave, as we talked about in a second, but I did want to ask my question, which is, I would love to get a better sense of how much the financial dependency on the extractive resources changes between 2002 and 2014. So it feels like at 2002, it's a major kneecapping of the budget, right? They have been getting all this money from these extractive revenues from these extracted resources. And now that money's gone. And so then when 2014 hits, is the shock by definition just going to be much, much, much smaller because it's this indirect effect of on through income, which is also split with the federal government and that sort of stuff? Or do you really feel like these, because you're telling us a story about you're comparing a temporary shock to a permanent shock. Whereas the alternative is to say you're comparing a shock that was very meaningful to a shock that's only marginally meaningful, precisely because they've already lost all the money from the extractive resources previously. So that was the one thing that I was kind of wondering about throughout the talk.
So I would agree that the 2014 shock was much less in magnitude compared to the 2002 shock. Still, looking at the budgetary data, it did have considerable impact. I don't have the data in front of me right now, but maybe in my work, I should show it in a more concrete way to bring in the data and to show that this is exactly how many percentage points the regional budget contracted after 2002 compared to that after 2014. This is what happened. So I think that's a very important suggestion. Thank you.
All right. So we have a couple of questions in the chat box. So I'm going to read the first question by Peter Rutland. Any particular reason why you did not also examine the 2008 price shock, which was bigger than 2014?
So I considered that. However, I thought of the 2008-9 shock to be more of a national shock that uniformly affected not only the oil and gas regions, but also the other regions. So from a causal identification perspective, I found that shock to be more less helpful compared to the 2014 shock. So that's why I decided to focus on 2014.
Could you just expand on this? In what sense? Because there was an overall economic, sort of global economic crisis. Is that what you?
Yes. So oil and gas prices did decline in 2008-9, but there was a global economic crisis that affected Russia on national level as well. So I thought it would be difficult for me to argue that whatever I find is due to negative revenue shock versus just overall economic crisis. And also, it would have been hard to use the difference in differences framework, I think, when resource poor regions are also affected considerably by this shock. And another reason, actually, I just remembered is that in the 2008-9 shock, the federal government actually tried to help out the regions. So my understanding is that the budgetary effects of the 2008-9 shock was actually not as considerable as in the 2014-15 shock.
So notwithstanding these caveats, which I agree with you, I think it's, in some sense, it would be an interesting and important comparison. And the reason why I think that is the case, among many others, is that the comparison of 2002 and 2014 is somewhat difficult because we are essentially in two different types of political regimes in Russia. So 2002 is still early days of Putin. There is still some sort of debate going on as to where the country is going to be, democracy-wise, involvement of government and business-wise, etc. Sort of by 2014, that becomes far less ambiguous, or very much non-ambiguous, right? So you're really comparing different types of revenue shocks, right? In a very different political environment. So that comparison, I would believe, is not as well controlled as comparison between 2008 and 2014 would be, again, notwithstanding the caveats you put. So one of those caveats, right, that there was a global crisis, is that, you know, it affected everybody, but, you know, because your comparisons are cross-regional, right? The fact that there was sort of total national shock on everyone in Russia shouldn't really put your differences in strategy in jeopardy as such, right? So I agree there could be some other issues over there, but I think that is the type of analysis that would be worth considering here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we also have a question by James Pyle. How do you think international sanctions influence the regressions and economic shocks, particularly after 2014?
So that was a big consideration for me because timing-wise, the decline in oil and gas prices have coincided with the international sanctions. I would respond with 2 points. First is that even though oil and gas regions have been affected by the international sanctions, they were not exclusively affected by the sanctions. So what I find in the diff and diff, the results, one can argue, I think, cannot be attributed to international sanctions directly. And the second point is that when I was on the ground, I actually learned that the regions have managed to deal with the requirements of the sanctions quite efficiently, firms, for example. So one of the requirements, if I remember correctly, was for Russian firms, oil and gas firms, not to be able to have loans for more than 90 days or something. And I've heard stories about how firms and their banks or partners in Western countries would basically cook the books. So they would come up with ways to get around it. So the feeling on the ground, again, it's just a very partial assessment, is that the effects of the sanctions in oil and gas regions may not have been as pronounced as we may believe.
Right. All right. Thank you for the answer. So we have one more question in the chat box. I will read it as well. And I actually had a similar question to ask. So thank you for, so this is a question from Don Van Atta. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce the name correctly. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. This work is complicated because the regional governments are not sovereign and independent. So your level of analysis is different from that of the resource curse literature that I know. The regional governments, which I guess the author means that the resource curse is formulated at the national level, the thesis, right? The regional governments changed substantially internally and in their relationships with the federal government between 2002 and 2014, and more between 1993 and now, of course. Does that secular change in the nature of regional government and their relation to the national government, which is the first shock you examine, affect your analysis of government actions, right? Again, sort of that's in line with my previous comment that, you know, in 2002, that's before the 2004 federal reform, right? And so comparison, again, is sort of loses comparability on that dimension as well.
So I 100% agree that there have been substantial changes in the region-federal center relations across these two shocks that I talk about. One way to kind of argue that this setup still works is that the this relationship, the changes in region and federal government relationship, I don't know if there is a reason to believe that it would be different for oil and gas regions in particular, or if it can be considered a change that led to similar loss of autonomy across all regions. If it's the latter, if I can argue that there's no good reason to believe that oil and gas regions' relationship with the federal government are not significantly different from government Moscow region relationship of other types of regions, then I think the diff and diff setup can be used to modify some of the concerns, because still, like after the 2002 shock, I still find a significant relationship between negative shocks and investment and small business entry. So to the extent that we can argue that it's a broad change, I think my empirical design can provide some grounds for me to argue that it would be okay, but I need to think more about it. That's a big challenge to my work as of now.
So I think in that regard, right, the earlier point about 2008 is highly relevant. Again, that would allow you to gain some traction and make the comparison more controlled. So we have one more question from Marjorie Balzer. Have you found major differences in the way the energy-rich republics have managed to negotiate and lobby with the central government? For example, is there a variation in the success level of Sakha and Tatarstan lobbying?
So among the energy-rich republics, I know Tatarstan quite well, and Sakha and other republics not so well. So my understanding is that generally Tatarstan is considered to be the most successful region to have negotiated with the federal center, not only when it comes to energy arrangements, but also in negotiating with in other aspects of policy, in education policy, in politics as well. And part of it is because Tatarstan had history of using its leverage very cleverly to deal with the federal government. And part of it is that it's a highly developed region compared to places like Sakha. So federal government, I would think, would have a more softer ear for what Tatarstan had to say.
So can I ask then maybe this will be last question unless someone else steps in. So it's getting back to sort of regional versus national. So what do you think, and this is of course just I'm asking for speculation because you didn't do this research, your research specifically compares regions, right? But thinking of a larger picture, in what ways do you think, what would be the caveats if we would want to extrapolate your argument from the regional level to the national level? Is there something that would impede, right, the extrapolation of your cross-regional results to the national level in a way that would make the argument closer to the way that the resource curse literature doing it?
So I think it can translate into the national level quite well with a couple of notes. So the first would be that it would actually be more applicable to the national level because, as mentioned, regional governments, especially regional governments in Russia, have much less policy tools compared to the national governments. So national governments, when properly incentivized, would have more tools it can utilize to support businesses and the business environment. Another kind of one scope condition that's important, I think, for whether my argument can travel either to national level or other regional context is a context of weak institutions. So I see the argument to be particularly applicable to institutions, to countries that are resource dependent and that have weak institutions in which government policies can lead to notable results in a short period of time, and that can consequently translate into a higher level of investment. So I think it would be probably harder to apply this argument in contexts like the US, where the business environment is not as dependent on state policies and more established compared to contexts like Russia. So that would be one important scope condition, I think.
All right. So please join me in thanking Degi for the nice presentation and for the answers to our questions. And I look forward to see future versions of this paper published in a book or separately in articles. And thanks again, Degi.
Thank you so much, Arturas and Sasha and the Jordan Center and everybody who came. Thank you.